Good afternoon, and apologies for the delay in starting. We've got a really fantastic panel here to talk about what I think is one of the great issues confronting those who believe, I suppose, in an internet which is free and available to all. The cost of freedom of information online. This is one of the great political battlegrounds of our time. In the age of the so-called war on terror, the revelations of WikiLeaks, for example, which exposed so much of the security apparatus, but the debate there about security versus freedom. Now, what I'm going to suggest we do is each of our fantastic panelists will have about 3 minutes to just briefly have a few talking points to open up the discussion. But what I want to do above all else is open up the floor to you, because I'm sure you're here because you have burning questions. So what I will do is just kick off with I think we'll start with Jodie Ginsberg, my compatriot. She joined the Index on Censorship, which is at the forefront, of course, of fighting for freedom of speech, not least in authoritarian regimes which persecute writers and activists and others. She's a former London bureau chief for Reuters, for more than a decade a foreign correspondent and business journalist, and also previously the head of communications for CamFed. So please give Jodie a big round of applause and she'll kick things off.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Firstly, thank you for giving up your lunch, which is rather fantastic, I have to say. So, or not giving up your lunch in this case. To come and listen to what I think is a really vital conversation and something that we haven't probably taken seriously enough until now. Index on Censorship has been campaigning on behalf of censored writers and artists for more than 40 years. And whereas in sort of 1989, we felt that we had really achieved something in terms of opening out freedom of expression globally, what we're seeing increasingly as the internet spreads and the use of internet spreads actually is the use by supposedly democratic regimes of methodologies that we thought were restricted to authoritarian ones, particularly in the internet space. Governments internationally have become much, much more concerned with security as a top priority, particularly in the wake of 9/11, and that has had really serious implications, I think, for our ability to express ourselves online freely. And we know from all of the people that we work with that government interventions, mass surveillance, for example, has a direct impact on the ability of journalists to express themselves freely, for whistleblowers to share information, and that is having serious implications. And my concern, and what I would want us to discuss today, is really how the precedents that are being set in democratic countries in the European Union are creating an environment in which free expression and freedom of information is increasingly constrained online, that the policies that are being set in places like Germany around hate speech will be copied with glee in places like Azerbaijan and Russia, and that means a race to the bottom where increasingly we won't be able to share information freely online, and that has a huge implications for not only our ability to express our own views and opinions, but also our ability to know and find out information that's at the heart of democratic institutions.
Fantastic. Next we'll move on to Jason Mchangama, is that right? Sorry.
Sort of.
That kind of. I think we'll let himself say his own name. He's based in Denmark. He's the director of the think tank Justitita. His studies, his research focused not just on law, human rights and democratization. He's written in a diverse range of foreign media, foreign affairs, foreign policy, The Wall Street Journal, The Economist and Politico Europe. Do you want to give some opening remarks? Give him a round of applause as well.
Thank you. I think we live in the midst of a paradox, really. So we've never ever before been able to communicate as freely, as instantly, as widely as now. Each of us will have at least 4 or 5 apps that allow us to communicate our thoughts freely to the world without any editor immediately in real time. 6 or 7 years ago, democracies would sort of celebrate this digital revolution. They would see it as a vindication of the values of the open society over sort of triumphing over the analogous walls of censorship of autocracies. But today, I very much agree with you, Jodie. I think that democracies have started to copy the playbook of autocracies. So if we measure internet freedom for 7 years in a row, it's been in decline. In Germany, you have a law now where social media companies can be fined up to 50 million euros if they don't remove illegal content. In the UK, you can go to prison for up to 15 years for viewing terrorist content online, which is, I think, one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard. And there are strong voices in European governments and also in the Commission that want to ban fake news. That is actually an agenda that Donald Trump would also like to copy. Unfortunately for him, there's a First Amendment which stops him from that. But a recent survey showed that 45% of Republican voters were in favor of courts being able to shut down media that broadcast inaccurate stories. So that's a fundamental change in our attitudes to free speech. So why is that? And I would suggest that new communication technologies tend to disrupt the established order for good and bad. And really, I think we should look back in time. This year we celebrate the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, and the Reformation was very much a success because of the printing press, which spread sort of the ideas that challenged the Catholic Church, that led to a scientific revolution, that brought down the old order of things. But the printing press also spread religious hatred. It spread ideas that caused war and destruction across Europe. And of course, it was not celebrated by everyone. There was centuries of censorship around Europe. But I think when we should answer the question, should we have more or less internet freedom, we should really ask ourselves the question, looking back, for all the disruption that the printing press caused, would the world be a better place for human beings to flourish in if we still had to ask permission to publish a book? And I think the answer to that is a clear no. So I think that we have to find ways to handle the disruption from fake news, hate speech, and so on without sacrificing internet freedom.
Fantastic stuff there from Jason. So Craig Fagan leads the Web Foundation's policy work over digital economy and the citizen participation programs, and focuses on governance, transparency, development, and also using technology for social change. Big round of applause for him as well.
So 3 minutes is a hard
We'll have a discussion, it's okay.
But no, because it's a very complicated issue. So to kind of build a little bit about this and about the Web Foundation. So the Web Foundation was started by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web. And then we're a charity organization. It's not like we're endowed, but he endowed us with his vision, which is that he gave the web back to everyone. He didn't sell it off. He didn't copyright it. He gave it back. And the discussion we're having today is related to the previous two panelists that mentioned about, well, how are we using this space? And how is this space a safe space for us? How do we feel secure? And the topic of the discussion, let's kind of break it down a little bit. So we've got on one side the issue of freedom of information. Let's have a reality check. 95 countries, according to the World Bank, have freedom of information laws. That doesn't mean that your rights are being protected in practice, but in law it's there. So when we think about the freedom of information discussion, we need to broaden it from the narrow perspective of the EU, US, UK. I'm from the US, I live in Germany. So we need to think about where this is. And as an organization, we're working in many different countries around the world, whether it's in Nigeria or South Africa or in Indonesia, where in many African countries, for example, there aren't freedom of information laws. It's not a guaranteed constitutional right. So when you think about the idea of whistleblowing and what that means, well, whistleblowing is even less protected. Most countries, there was a study done on the G20, so economies that are considered the leading economies, most do not have protections for whistleblowers. So if I had a problem, I have nowhere to go. I can't say that I talk to my boss if I see something going on. So we put this together with what's happening in the digital space, and we're more interconnected, and we have more data about us. Look what just happened with the Paradise Papers. I don't think we can ignore this, and your own paper published part of this. So we're talking about a data dump of 13 million files that was given to various papers. Why wasn't it put in the public domain? Because if I was to look at it, I would never understand it. I would not be able to make sense of it. It would take me a long time. We have people that, whether it's about information or data, or intermediaries, or those that kind of provide that bridge to us making sense of what's being put out into our digital space. So why did someone provide 13 million files to papers? Because they probably felt that they had no other recourse or protections to go anywhere else. And if you look at recent history about protections for people that are whistleblowing, I mean, how many people are familiar with LuxLeaks in the audience? Okay, very few of us, right? This was a case about private company files, again, in the matching to the Paradise Papers, where it was delivered to various governments about tax, basically tax schemes, right? Of people avoiding taxes and trying to set up, keeping their money hidden, including from the German government. So in the end, the people that were involved in this have all had fines and have had court sentences. So if you are a whistleblower and you have nowhere to go, you see that this is what's happening in reality, even in the EU, why would I want to blow the whistle in any other country? Now, I'm at time, but I just wanted to raise another point about kind of thinking with this, the bridge. Information, we have rights to information, and that's something, even though it's not protected in countries, needs to be there. And we also have a right to data. And as an organization, the Web Foundation works on this idea of the concept of data. And how do we improve that data? Part of it is being more open. We do a survey that just came out, for example, of 115 countries, so covering all the countries I just mentioned, not just our EU-US focus. And we see that most countries are not releasing data sets. 9 out of 10 data sets that we studied are not being proactively released, meaning that if I want to find information about what's happening with the public contracts on the road that are being built in my town, I can't get this. So why does that matter? Well, think about issues of corruption, think about issues of transparency and accountability, and then link that back to a whistleblower who might see this in their own institution and have nowhere to go. And when we think about the right to data, also remember that we're taxpayers. When it comes to government data, we're actually paying the government to collect this information on us. So we have a very complicated scenario here. It's not something that has a one-pronged solution, but we need to understand the trifecta effect, so to speak, these triangle of saying better whistleblowing protections, which are not on the books, better open data policy, so we have that information, and better freedom of information, which is not a right in many of the countries across the world.
Fantastic stuff. A lot pressed into a very short space of time, so well done. Finally, we've got Elodie Vialle, who is Head of Journalism and Technology at Reporters Without Borders, who do inspirational work at a time when reporters are increasingly threatened by authoritarian regimes, their lives even. She's a former editor-in-chief of a news website on social innovation. She's lectured at various French journalism schools. She's frequently on TV as a pundit. And served as a digital strategic consultant for international media in developing countries. Give a big round of applause as well.
Thanks. Just a few words to start with to tell you more about Reporters Without Borders, no more than 20 seconds, I swear, because we are a well-known organization and at the same time not so well-known. We are one of the largest worldwide organizations focused on press freedom. We fight for press freedom, and we have 12 offices. We're based in Paris. Actually, that explains my French accent. And we have 12 offices all around the world in UK, US, Washington, D.C., in Tunis, Rio, Berlin, and so on. And we are operating worldwide through a network of 130 correspondents. At RSF, we have been fighting during 32 years to get journalists out of jail. And for more than a decade, we've been fighting against what I call invisible prisons. By invisible prisons, I mean internet shutdown, online censorship, surveillance, and more hate speech, online harassment against journalists. So what we do, our most well-known production, I guess all of you know that we produce the World Freedom of the Press Index. This is a tool for advocacy for us released every year, and bad guys are in dark, actually. And I have other maps if you want to. This one is for you.
Oh, that's very,
yes, it's a gift for
very
you.
kind of you.
And there is one other project we just launched in Washington, D.C. I really want to talk about about you. It's named Forbidden Stories, and Forbidden Stories, it's a project aimed at securing data, protecting data, and keeping the work of journalists who are threatened. And if they are killed or arrested, then we can pursue their work, that we can publish their work. It's a kind of worldwide newsroom. It's a kind of life insurance for journalists, Forbidden Stories. So today we are an organization. We represent civil society. We fight for press freedom. We lobby international organizations. We have a UN consultative status. We lobby governments in authoritarian regimes. And we lobby more and more tech companies as well. Because what we see, what we say is that rights, press rights that are guaranteed offline have to be guaranteed online as well. And the matter is that giants of the web, Facebook, Google, they play the role of arbitrators of press freedom online. And in every just to finish with, in every democratic system, you need checks and balances system. The more power you have, the more checks and balances you need. And the matter today is that there is a huge lack of checks and balances. And I think that for us, human rights defenders, press freedom defenders, social network regulation is going to be a huge topic we need to deal with.
Fantastic. Well, very wide-ranging thoughts there. Before I open it up, I suppose liberty versus security. I have a particular interest in this. My twin sister, an activist, was recently held under Britain's punitive anti-terrorism legislation. She had a mobile phone and a computer forcibly taken and copied. There's a so-called Snoopers Charter in Britain, hotly contested, introduced by our disintegrating Conservative government at the moment. But as you mentioned, there's proposals to make it illegal. So you could be sentenced for many years for looking at terrorist material online. But the argument with a lot of this legislation is if you've got nothing to hide, then you've got nothing to worry about. What's your thought? I mean, that's the cliched argument. Yeah. What's your thoughts on that?
The thing is, I think we have to remember that the right to privacy is something that's inherent that you can't take away. And many governments, increasingly in this data age, right? You mentioned this, Owen, about all our devices. I mean, it's not only the UK. The US there's been large stories about people trying to go through border control and asked to be giving up their passwords, which is completely against our right to privacy. So in a more datafied world, the right to privacy is even more essential.
Jodie, I mean, we had a number of terrorist attacks in...
Nonsense.
Well, I agree with you, but I've got to play devil's advocate.
It is a fact that surveillance affects the way in which individuals operate. And it's not just, it's not just contained within David Egger's The Circle. It happens in real life. So we know that journalists, writers, activists behave differently when they know that they're under surveillance. Surveillance directly impacts the ability of individuals who are trying to get to the heart of corruption, abuse of power. It directly affects their ability to do that work quite dramatically. And what's really concerning is that in many cases, it's the hardware and the software that's developed in supposed democracies that is being exported to places like Yemen so that the Yemeni authorities can use it to spy on journalists and dissidents and crack down on them. And we are seeing a marked increase in the number of journalists, activists, campaigners and others who are being thrown in jail, detained for long periods of time on suspicion of having done something wrong without ever coming to trial. And that's a noticeable increase in 2017.
I mean, just to maybe bring you in as well, within the European Union, you've got the likes of Hungary, which is an increasingly authoritarian regime, using, for example, Trump's rhetoric on fake news to justify its own war against independent media. I mean, to what extent should we be concerned that democracies, so-called, are becoming, we get these kind of managed democracies with increasingly authoritarian governments? Turkey is another one, Poland even. I mean, is that something you're seeing yourself with Reporters Without Borders? And what does that mean online?
What does that mean online? That means that they block websites. It means surveillance for journalists, and we strongly fight against dual-use technologies, meaning that European startups in France, in Italy, in UK, they are selling digital surveillance tools to authoritarian regime, and then after that activists are put in jail. So this is something we fight against, and what we can do, and one thing we do for instance is that when those countries they block websites, we try to circumvent it while creating copies of those websites. We call it collateral freedom, because if they want to block our copy, then they will have to block all the internet in their country, which it results huge damages and economical and political damages. So this is how we try to do that.
I'll bring in the audience in a minute,
Yeah.
but do you have any quick thoughts
Yeah,
on
no,
that?
I think there's a noticeable change in European democracies. I mean, I come from Denmark, which is one of the most liberal countries in the world. So, after the Second World War, we had a period where you could openly, if you were Nazi, you could openly distribute Nazi leaflets on the streets. Communists were in parliament, so basically anything. You could do anything. Now we have a government that in less than 2 years has introduced, I think, 3 bills limiting freedom of expression, aimed basically at radical Islamists. But these things will change the political culture, not just in Denmark, but in Europe. So if you have a law that is, you say, well, it's well understood that this is only aimed, at extreme militant Muslims. What will really happen is that it will not only affect them, but it will be used when the agenda changes,
Exactly.
and then it will be very difficult to achieve the same level of freedom before, because everyone has a but, especially when you're a politician. You're in favor of free speech, but you can always come up with a very good reason why fake news or hate speech or blasphemy or whatever should be limited.
And just quickly before we bring the audience
No,
in.
just to say that, let's not forget where we are. We're at the Web Summit. Look around the banners. See the companies that are up there. Let's just remember that Facebook was just called out about a week ago about shutting down news sites in countries from Guatemala to Slovenia, where this was bread and butter for them. So you all of a sudden sort of turn the switch on it. It's not just about internet shutdowns, which are on the rise. Let's flag that too. There's a network called Keep It On, hashtag Keep It On has been tracking this. It's gone up. It's about 66th year to date, more than last year. So we see a trend as we become more digital. It's very easy to pull the switch, or we have companies that are pulling the switch for us.
Fantastic. Right, do we have a microphone out of interest? Is there a microphone? Sorry. Should we put your hands up. I'll grab 2 of you. Try and get a man and a woman there. Are there any women who want to speak as well, so we can have a bit of balance? And the woman over there. Thank you very much. So the gentleman here. And if you can be quick, because the clock is literally counting down there in front of us, and I've been told security will drag us off.
So I guess the issue you raised about Facebook is, as I understand it, they switched the way in which some news sites are displayed, and so right at the worst time from Cambodia, where I'm from, everything about a news sort of shutdown did not appear on people's feeds. Is that...
Yeah. Algorithms, you mean? Well,
Yeah.
So the woman over there. So that's changes to algorithms. Yeah, we'll come on to both of you. Go for it.
You've all made good cases for why we should continue to keep freedoms as we move into a more digital age. But what do we do about fake information or the spread of information that is untrue or difficult in some way or problematic?
I'm glad you didn't use fake news. We're going to abandon that. So that point about Facebook changing its algorithms, for example, in Cambodia, and also the spread of information which is not correct and how it proliferates on social media. Who wants to kick off?
Yeah.
Do you want to start over there?
I'll kick off with that word we're not using.
We're not.
I think we have to be really, really careful about this. What we're seeing at the moment is all sorts of sort of technological solutions being posited that will allow us to somehow arrive at the truth. And I think that's just as worrying as the fact that algorithms, which I think will be addressed shortly, being used to filter out news. I think essentially what we need to do is encourage people to understand the difference between news that they can trust and news that they can't trust, and be able to differentiate. And that is about, I think, understanding that simply if something looks like a genuine news site doesn't necessarily mean that it is a news site, and encouraging people to think in a questioning way about where information is coming from, what the information tells them, how is it sourced. And I think we don't ask those questions enough, and we don't encourage people to ask those questions sufficiently.
Elodie.
One thing, we won't talk about fake news. Just have a look at the Claire Waldorf last report for Council of Europe. She talks about misinformation, malinformation, disinformation, and I think that we should use this typology. Another thing is that regarding Facebook new functionality, Explore. This is a way we don't want them to use this kind of tools, and this is a way to relegate journalism to the sellers of Facebook. And we think that they have a responsibility. They need to take their responsibility in the spreading of disinformation, and this functionality is not, they do totally the opposite. They muzzle independent media, such as in Cambodia, for instance.
So can we just take two very, very quick questions, because we've got 3 minutes left on the clock. Who is the... So you at the back, if we can be very quick. Maybe on whistleblowers, for example. Anyone got any questions on that? Go for it.
Sure. I was curious whether you think it's better to regulate the algorithms or regulate the content itself, and how do you think about that in terms of these big tech titans?
And anybody else, quickly, while we've got time? No, go for it then.
Maybe I'll take content and algorithms. So just quickly, so Tim Berners-Lee published a letter in March on the web's birthday, its anniversary, and he laid out this concern about the future of the web and with fake news, and also let's not forget politically targeted advertising, which goes to your point about algorithms and content. I think what Jodie mentioned about the slippery slope. There's a question when you have a race to the bottom. I think content is a question that is a much, if you start to regulate content too heavily, and we see this discussion happening in US policy circles, it can create a very negative effect, because if you set the bar here in the US on one thing, it will quickly spread to a country like China and Russia, which has a very different set of rules they play by when it comes to journalism, whistleblowing, etc., and our data. Algorithms, I think, is sort of raises the question of the Wild West. There definitely needs to be regulation. From our side, we've looked into this. Other people are definitely looking at this as well. And if we don't find a way to understand that it has a social and political and economic impact on our lives, like anything else around us, there needs to be regulation. And it's not enough for companies to do it themselves. We need the right balance from the side of governments.
Jason, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would be dead set against regulating content. I mean, imagine the First Amendment didn't have as strong protections, and you had to pass a law saying, we'll ban fake news. I mean, do you imagine in the current climate in the U.S. that Republicans and Democrats could agree on a definition of what constituted disinformation? I mean, it would be a political weapon wielded against each other. And we have a very bad precedent, actually, from U.S. History with the Seditions Act from 1798. Which was basically used by President John Adams to persecute people who disagreed with him, Jeffersonians. So we've gone down that road before. I don't think that's something that we should repeat.
Just to bring it back on this issue about whistleblower, which you mentioned, I think that we have to understand, as we're in this more digified world, our data's out there. We've got the largest data dumps happening, and the Paradise Papers was largest. So if we don't find ways to protect whistleblowers, we're only going to have more of this, and we need to make sure the digital space and our protections provide
Very
for
quick
that.
before security drag us out.
No to regulation, yes to more transparency. We need much more transparency for internet companies about all their decision-making processes, including what they remove and why they shut down.
Perfect. A rallying cry for press freedom and defence of civil society. Give them a big round of applause.